Trust in others is great. It saves time and it saves money. And Norwegians are known to be more trusting than most. So when should you report on a colleague's strange behavior? When do you have an insider risk? And what do you do? We are about to get some informed answers. Our keynote speaker is a social scientist and an expert on personnel security. At the United States Department of Defense, he is director of PERSEREC, which is the Defense Personnel and Security Research Center. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Eric Lang.
Thank you. Thank you, Siri. And special thanks to my colleagues at the National Security Authority for hosting this conference, for allowing me to participate, and for their warm hospitality on my first visit to beautiful Norway. And you may be interested to know that I have a family connection. My wife's grandparents, with family names like Kleppi and Starhug, immigrated from Norway to the United States. I didn't know them, but the family taught me 3 words: lutefisk, lefse, and ufta. And so far on this trip, I cannot find a restaurant that serves ufta. So the Director General's comments this morning highlighted that we all face a serious and growing security risk. And that risk has a technological side and a human side. And the way that we understand and manage that risk can make or break an office, an organization, or a nation. For my part, I'll be talking about the human side, specifically the risk of an organization's insiders, so an organization's employees, contractors, and partners. And PERSEREC dedicates more than half of its research portfolio to studying, understanding insider threat, and helping to mitigate it. So a little bit about PERSEREC. We were started in 1986. We're a Department of Defense organization, but we consult to all parts of the government, non-governmental organizations, and of course, our closest allies. And our formal mission statement is to use applied social science to improve the efficiency, effectiveness, and fairness of personnel security, suitability, and reliability programs. Personnel security being the security clearance program. So the key there is science-based policy recommendations and tools. And I should say that the slides and the words today are mine alone. They're not official statements of any part of the US government. So the first thing we can ask are, what are the types of insider threat? It's an umbrella term. And you can see from the top 4 categories, it includes classic government espionage, the private sector equivalent of corporate espionage, terrorism and workplace violence, vandalism and information technology operators who, through anger, bring down their computer system. And then that final category of reliability problems and gross negligence. These are a different kind of individual who believe that they are good and loyal employees. They are not out to hurt their organization, but because they may suffer with some kind of personal problem, alcohol, drug abuse, or a severe mental health issue, they fail to protect security and sensitive systems, so they become a risk. Now, just taking the top 4 categories, you can look at the social science literature, and we find that within each category and across categories, there is tremendous variation in the motivation and the behaviors of the people who perpetrate these kinds of insider threats. So in terms of motivations, we see national ideology, religion, vengeance, egotism, greed, and many others, and the behaviors sometimes are slow, planful, and methodical, and sometimes they're more opportunistic and fast. So what we find is across these, there is no single valid and reliable social science model to predict insider threat. The descriptive models are getting better and more complex, but we cannot yet predict who will be the next attacker. So the next question we can ask is, what is the magnitude of insider threat problems and examples? And of course, the first type, which was highlighted this morning, is cybercrime. So cybercrime is huge. It will shortly account for $6 trillion of damage across the world, or over 46 trillion Norwegian kroner of damage. And the president of IBM said it's the biggest threat facing all organizations. But the most important part of this is that the majority of cybercrime is either committed by malicious insiders or it's facilitated by negligent insiders. So it's an insider risk issue. We can look at the percentages of these types of crimes, and you can see that 62% are individuals who are stealing from their organization in an attempt to create an additional line of income while they're employed. Another 29% are individuals who are stealing, looking for personal gain as they plan to exit their organization, and 9% are saboteurs or angry at their organization. So of course, there's many other forms of insider threat. Two very serious forms are espionage, and we know that government espionage creates severe damage to personnel, to operations, to national interests of the US and our allies worldwide. And then workplace violence, it's more of an issue in the United States, but it's an issue everywhere. Even within the Department of Defense, our inside attacks have caused the loss of lives of dozens of people and wounded many more. So now we can ask, if we look inside one of these types, and PERSEREC studies espionage, and we have a file of spies against America that goes back to the end of the Second World War. And we have 209 perpetrators in there, and we can look at the case studies and the trends over time. We put out a series of reports. Our fourth update is now available on our website, 2017. I'll put up the URL for that website at the end. Some of the things we learned from those studies is that there is no consistent or useful demographic profile of a spy. So we can learn things sociologically about the patterns, the case studies, and trends, but because the 209 spies come from a population of cleared personnel over 70+ years that totals over 20 million, our population of spies is 1/1000th of 1%. So you can't use that to create a useful profile for the other cleared personnel. We find increasingly that the spies are not military personnel, they're becoming more civilian. We know that greed is the most common motive, but over time, this motive is decreasing. And this relates to the next 2 points. An increasing number of spies are volunteering their services versus being recruited by a foreign intelligence service. And more spies now have divided loyalties. So you can see a pattern starting to emerge here, and I'll put up a table shortly. And we look at our espionage laws and how we prosecute, and we're finding that our espionage laws are becoming increasingly out of step with the technological aspect of espionage. And I'll put up a little more information shortly. So here's a table of motivations. And you can see the oldest cohort on the left column, and then the most recent cohort on the right column. And you can see money still is the highest single motivator, but it has decreased from the earliest cohort down to 28% in the most recent cohort. And underneath that, you can see divided loyalties are increasing from 17% to 22%. And then I would also draw your attention to ingratiation and recognition and ego. You can see that they were only accounting for 6% and 2% respectively early on. They are now 15% and 13%. So those are increasing as well. In terms of the laws, we find that the US laws don't allow us to prosecute as many for life sentences as we had earlier, and a greater number of laws are needed to prosecute information abuses, things like our Export Control Act. And the bottom line here is that our espionage-related laws are becoming increasingly out of step with 21st century technology. You can imagine our Espionage Act is about 100 years old. It didn't anticipate electronic forms like an Excel file. So it says a document, and lawyers are now arguing, what is a document? Is an Excel file a document if it's stolen? So there's a need to revise and integrate those laws. So I'm going to get into some lessons learned about insider threat, but I want to give you a broader understanding of what PERSEREC does, the various areas we work in, and that will give you a basis to understand how we derive our lessons learned. So the first is we look ahead at emerging threats and opportunities, such as social media. And with any new area, we have three challenges: investigation, authentication, and adjudication. So for internet-based information, of all the information out there, what should you spend time investigating? What is productive in terms of the information, and what is fair and ethical and in keeping with our constitutional rights and privacy and civil liberties? Once the information is collected, we have to ask, how do we authenticate it to make sure that that information is truly from the subject of interest? And then once we determine it is, how do we authenticate it? Of all the various information, speech-related and other kinds of information, what has adjudicative value to make a decision about a person's fitness for government employment or to hold a security clearance? The one thing I can tell you is, if you put aside the gray areas of free speech and just look at the clear areas, we find in social media there are clear indicators of criminal and other serious derogatory behavior. And the most important point is, in many cases, the social media information is the only source that that information is identified from. It is not available through other kinds of record checks and criminal checks. So it is a unique, productive source of information. The second area is contextual and organizational variables. And we find it's important to look at things like organizational climate and culture, the norms within an office and within an organization-wide and then societal-wide, and to see how those contextual factors interact with personal background factors to either exacerbate or facilitate an insider risk. The third area is automated continuous evaluation, and this speaks to the need to look at individuals or monitor them in a way that's effective and fair after employment or after they've received their security clearance. The tailored vetting means that you can use a risk-managed approach in terms of what you know about the individual, what their job entails, and then tailor the kinds of checks and monitoring to fit those factors. The next area, is definitions and metrics for quality. And that just speaks to a need to identify, when we have a policy or a program, what is the ultimate measure of success, and are we creating metrics that can gather data on exactly the thing we're trying to achieve? Because without that, you don't have a good ability to monitor a program, feed it back, and continuously improve it. And the last category is assessing mental health issues. And here we have the challenge of identifying which mental health issues have the greatest relationship to an insider threat, and then how we can investigate those effectively and fairly so that we determine what is relevant to a person's clearance, and how not to increase stigma. We do not want to increase stigma against mental health issues, and we always want to ensure that people who have mental health challenges seek the services they need. So here are some insights and lessons learned. The first one is that for insider threat mitigation, the policies, training, and the technological factors are important, and I should stop there. The policy, training, and technology is important. I know we have a lot of technologists in the audience. Those are critical, they're necessary, but they are not sufficient. The more important aspect are the human factors. I'll acknowledge my bias, I'm a research psychologist, but we see through so many attacks that there was always a component of some human who either made a bad decision, a delayed decision, or was simply wrong in the actions they took. The second area is that improving supervisor and coworker reporting is probably the biggest opportunity to improve insider threat management. Again, we see that in almost every attack, somebody, a supervisor or a coworker, saw something or knew something, and they either didn't report it in a timely fashion, or the report was mishandled. So we have policies that say reporting should happen, but there's a huge gap to overcome the psychological barriers, things like diffusion of responsibility. So when evidence of a growing threat surfaces in a workplace, an individual may say, that's a concern, but lots of people know that. I'm sure someone else will report it. So that's diffusion of responsibility. And we need to find ways to understand and mitigate those psychological barriers so we get better reporting. The third is that organizations need to develop better communication with employees. We send out written communications, but we need to better understand and evaluate what employees actually think, and do our best to ensure that they're developing an intrinsic, a personal sense of organizational responsibility. It's those employees that have that intrinsic sense that are our best support and our best defense against insider threat. And next we need to better understand the organizational cultures and climates. I mentioned that earlier. In social psychology, we see that almost all interesting human behaviors, the good behaviors and the bad behaviors, are an interaction between different levels of organizational influences and the individual's background. And what governments and other organizations tend to do is we focus too much on the individual's background. It's partly a Western philosophical bias to hold the individual more accountable, and we think that it's easier just to look at individual indicators. But we really need to look at the interaction between things like toxic leadership, stress levels, tolerance for rule breaking, and the way that those organizational and even office norms can create additional risk when they interact with background factors. The next point is that the initial investigation is very important. We need to keep that, but continuous evaluation is more important. So continuous evaluation is what we do after a person is cleared. For example, for many governments, a top secret clearance will involve a periodic reinvestigation every 5 years. And some of the spies in America have stated they saw that the 5-year window for reinvestigation was a 5-year window to misbehave, because they knew that the continuous evaluation system was weak. We also find that among the 209 spies, almost every one of them came into their government employment as loyal individuals wanting to do a good job. So they passed their initial vetting correctly, but somewhere later, they developed a problem, they developed a grievance, they became greedy, and they went bad. So we do need the initial vetting, but the continuous evaluation system is more important. The next point is that we need to integrate many different relevant sources of information. So Worldwide, we're starting to do a better job of this, but we need to integrate sources from user activity monitoring and performance evaluation systems and criminal records and financial records. These will help us understand if there's undue affluence. They're buying multiple homes without mortgages on a low salary, or they're developing money problems that they're not managing well, and they could be running into stresses that they'll try to cope with in a bad way. So we have to integrate many more systems of information. This will help us uncover patterns and know how to follow up. The two most important components that need to be integrated are security and human resources. So too often, the security personnel and the human resource personnel think that they have separate missions, but we find that insider threat management involves a close collaboration and a close communication between especially those two parts of an organization. So leadership has to recognize this and then create open avenues of communication so that they can help uncover patterns. And in some cases, it will be a security issue. It goes to your counterintelligence office. And in some cases, the same ambiguous behavior will become an employee assistance program or an HR issue. So the next point is to recognize that indicator lists are very important, but we all like simple crutches. We like simple recipes. We put out a list and say, if you see these behaviors, then this will mitigate your insider threat. The indicator list is a beginning, but it's only a beginning. The most important part of the process and the management involves how you follow up, how you determine if this is a psychological issue and needs clinical evaluation, or if this is a counterintelligence issue and needs to go to that office. So again, we see the need for the security, HR, and the other components to work together. The next issue is that most mental health issues are not threat issues. So this becomes a little bit complex because we do notice, for example, with workplace violence, that many of the perpetrators have mental health issues. It is also true when you look at the statistics of mental health issues across your organization and across large populations, that most individuals, the vast majority of individuals with mental health issues, will never be violent. So we have to remember that. The vast majority will never be violent. So we have to find a way to investigate the mental health issues in our organization, to get them properly vetted, and at the same time make sure we do not send an inappropriate message to employees that suggests that we hold mental health problems as a bad thing. If you instigate stigma, then you can incentivize employees not to get the mental health treatment they need, and then whatever part of the work role they have, that will become worse, and they'll become a threat. Or they could lie on their personnel security form about whether they've had mental health treatment. Now, in the US, getting mental health treatment will not automatically undermine your clearance. Lying on a government security form will. So we need to make sure that we don't create undue stigma. Data science approaches are incredibly helpful, but we have to make sure we include the social science behind that. So you cannot open up a web page or a magazine without seeing something about data science and big data. These approaches are instrumental. PERSEREC has a small data science program, and I think the opportunities to move the field forward, especially with insider threat, are vast. But what we're also seeing in many different domains, in legal domains and law enforcement, that there's brute force empiricism, a love of numbers and large data sets for the sake of large numbers. And so, for example, we've seen in the law enforcement system programs like parole evaluations, where they've studied many, many decades of US parole decisions, and they've created a huge database with hundreds of thousands of cases and fields, on background factors, to determine which individuals are more likely to experience recidivism, to have another criminal problem, and to be a bad risk to release early on parole. So the developers of this system were very proud. It had hundreds of thousands of cases and very high statistical reliability. But then what we found is it was very powerful and very biased, because the data that they had used going back far enough included times when the law enforcement system included racially biased decisions. So what they had done is created a huge and powerful system that automated bias. If they had included social scientists to understand the nature of the data and the potential for bias, they could have made that a more useful system. So this is my homily on making sure that when we do something that is technologically useful, we also understand it substantively. The next issue is the need to increase the speed without jeopardizing the quality of the way we make policy, particularly government policy. So we know in Western political systems, often they're bicameral systems, and it's a slow and deliberative process. This is good. This is, works through constitutional division of powers. It ensures that there are multiple voices, that there's transparency, and this is a good process for making robust and fair laws. What we're finding, though, is that the laws as they pertain to insider threat, particularly technological aspects of insider threat, are increasingly becoming too reactive, too slow to address the 21st century technological speed of problems. So I don't have a solution to this. If there are any senior politicians in the room, I would love to talk with you, because we need to maintain the open dialogue and the good process of making laws, but we need, especially for insider threat and technology, to find a way not to get behind the curve, to keep up with the problems and timely solutions. And then we need to improve the definitions of metrics and quality. If you take something like coworker and supervisor reporting, we'll often measure the quality of that program by the fact that 100% of employees receive the training, and many of them were satisfied and feel competent in their behavior to carry out those requirements. What we see in the social science literature is the fact that a subject's confidence is almost unrelated to their behavioral capability. So we need to find a better way to measure the behavior of interest and to see how our programs and policies are doing, and then feed back that quality information into the policy decision makers and the operational managers so they can improve that. And this last one is not so much a social science as a personal observation over several decades. Conferences such as this are critically important. They're very valuable, they're very helpful, but they're not sufficient to make the best progress to understanding and mitigating insider threat. What we need to do between these conferences is stay in touch, learn from, and inspire each other. And I am going to do my part. This is the web address where you can find additional reports and some tools that may interest you, and my personal contact information, in the hope that together we can make the world a better and safer place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lang. I think we're going to start taking questions straight away to you. So if you have a question, please use your telephone and send a question to 2077. Start the question with NSM space, and then we will get the question up here. But there is something I wonder about, because you say that continuous evaluation is actually more important than that initial vetting. How do you do it in practice? A continuous evaluation.
Right, so that's an excellent question, and what we need to do is integrate the classic records. I'll talk more about that this afternoon. We need a net approach to neutralize enterprise threat, and you need to integrate classic records from things like criminal record checks and financial record checks with more local records, and then supervisor and coworker reporting, so that you can understand the development of an indicator early, and then it's all about follow-up. So currently, most organizations rely too much on one source of record check and self-report. And of course, people planning bad behavior often don't self-report it. So, so we need external sources to give us indicators and to see patterns.
Yeah. It sounds like it demands a massive apparatus to actually be able to go into all the sources and keep this overview. Is it realistic, do you think, for a small country to do so?
The short answer is yes, and the second shorter answer is there really is no alternative unless you want to accept greater levels of risk. You can outsource some of this. There are different companies that will do a variety of record checks, so one part can be outsourced, and then you can integrate that information with sensitive government information. But my recommendation is wherever you are on the continuous evaluation spectrum, you need to understand your own risks and look at how to improve your CE.
A question: to what extent should employers monitor their employees' behavior on social media?
So when PERSEREC investigates social media, we only look at open source. We do not require passwords. We do not go behind firewalls. I think the larger employment system should do it, not the direct supervisor. And there should be policies on how to do it to make sure it's efficient, effective, and fair. And there are many things you have to look at to be fair. For example, when we pull in social media information, it may have, let's say you're a cleared personnel, information on you, it may have pictures on you, and it may have pictures of family members. So if you're a cleared person, we're allowed to evaluate you. We have no rights to evaluate your family members, so we have to have the organization collecting it take that information out so that we don't compromise their privacy.
And someone asks in the audience that some of the measures appear to be plain surveillance of employees. Not that easy to do in Scandinavia. Your comment?
I'm not an expert on Scandinavia, and I think it's a delicate balance. We have the same issues about whether the government is becoming big brother. So the key goes back to the communication with the employee. First, the policymakers, the organizational leaders need to decide what is the risk and how do we want to address it. My recommendation is be transparent with the employees. We have risk. Risk affects all of us. If you like your organization, it's important to you. And here's how we're going to monitor it with certain kinds of surveillance and have dialogue with the employees. Hear what their concerns are and make sure that the policy is understood, it's transparent, employees have a chance to ask questions, and you're not doing things to undermine their trust. Because whatever you develop, if you undermine employee trust, your system will not work. You won't get reporting into the system, and your system will fail.
How do you create understanding for the need to adapt to internal threats within an organization with open data policy and a large part of research?
With open data policies? I'm not sure I understand that question.
I think the person asking the question means that how do you create that understanding for internal threats if your organization has an open data policy? Is it possible to find that perfect balance?
So it's easy to recommend a perfect balance, but I think, again, it comes down to your organization, your particular type of risk. Some organizations are more at risk for cybercrime, some more for espionage, and it starts with the evaluation and then the inclusion of the employee voice. But the employees have to be viewed as partners in mitigating risk, otherwise it doesn't work.
You mentioned also the moral barriers against snitching. When in doubt, what do you recommend?
Well, when in doubt, you should report. And then the key there is whether you've developed organizational trust with the employee. I don't know if we have time. I've had 2 or 3 times, and once, I'll just mention it, as a junior employee in an organization, I witnessed a senior manager who had slurred speech, wasn't making sense, and was physically wobbly. And I thought, these are classic indicators of being drunk on the job. I knew that my responsibility was to report this to the director of the organization. The director of the organization was a close friend of this senior manager. I wanted to remain employed, and I had a little bit of a quandary. In this case, I did report it to the director, and the director said, "Thank you very much. That person is diabetic. What you witnessed was a low blood sugar reaction, and we need to get him a little bit of sugar immediately." So the reason that worked is because I did trust that my organization would handle that information appropriately. It wouldn't come back as retribution to me. There wouldn't be some kind of negative result from the manager to me. So in that situation, it worked. But it's an example of how the behavior observed, the risk observed, is potential risk, and it's about the follow-up and the trust in the organization that allows it to be processed correctly.
What if the person you see behaving suspiciously or strangely is directly above you in the line of command and actually has the power to sack you?
So in our organization, if one of my employees decides that I'm exhibiting a risk factor, they would not go to me, they would go to a security officer. And that person is relatively independent, and they can keep that information confidential, and it never has to come back to me who reported it.
You mentioned also the screening that is going on to many positions, but and you see a growing share of civilians in espionage and that field. Do you see a need for more screening of people seeking powerful offices in the US?
So I'm not sure what you mean by powerful offices. So remember in my answers, even though I'm a government employee, I do not have diplomatic immunity when I go back to the US. So.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. How does big data trends and analysis help to detect disloyal employees? Have you seen any concrete examples?
So certainly in the cyber security realm, we're finding that user activity monitoring, it's only one slice, but it lends itself very well to big data analysis and even sentiment analysis of things like email and other kinds of traffic. So that right now is the biggest opportunity for data science approaches to surface patterns of risk.
Thank you so much, Erik Lang. I think that's what we have time for. Thank you so much for coming. And as Erik told you, he will be speaking more and repeat your topic once more later on today.
Neutralizing enterprise threat, the net approach. And I learned 2 more words. Tusen takk.
Tusen takk.